It's 6 o'clock right now. I guess we'll get rocking and rolling. All right. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction. Welcome, everybody. I see there's a few more participants jumping in right now. My name is Matthew Adams. I'm the Associate Director of Graduate Admissions for the Helmholtz College of Arts and Sciences. And I'd like to welcome our presenter today, Dr. Charles L. Zelden. This is a virtual lecture series. Dr. Zelden, he's a professor of the Department of Humanities and Politics here at NSU, Nova Southeastern University. And he teaches courses in history, government, and legal studies. Dr. Zelden's a legal constitutional historian by training and has published and contributed to many books and articles, presentations, including a book published this year with Sally Hayden titled Race, Power, and the Law, Southern Legal and Constitutional History. Some of Dr. Zelden's research interests include constitutional history, the judicial process, civil rights, voting rights, and election law. But tonight's lecture is going to be in large part an informational webinar entitled Elections Have Consequences, the 2020 presidential election and the future of national security and civil rights in America. At this point, Dr. Zelden, I'd like to turn it over to you, and we're available for questions as well as myself and Assistant Director Nicole Chavans. After this lecture, if you're interested in any of our graduate programs like our National Security and International Affairs Masters and our Graduate Certificate program. All right.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. I guess the best way to start is with who I am. I am, as mentioned, a constitutional and legal historian, but I've always worked sort of on the borderland of law, history, and politics, which brings me into the realm of national security as it affects American government, American society, and our place in the world. My background, again, as a historian, is that I use the past as a window to try and understand the forces which shape the present and thus the future. And so my classes that I teach tend to have historical focus, but ultimately getting to current issues, and we often discuss current issues in light of past events. I fundamentally teach two classes in the master's program in national security and international relations. One is called American Government and Domestic Security, and the other is National Security and Civil Liberties. The first class really is, in many ways, a history class. It is an examination of how national security issues, domestic in particular, have shaped the evolution of American government. We start with the quasi-war of 1798 and the passage of, in response to that, the Alien and Sedition Acts, our first effort to shape national security concerns here at home through the passage of federal laws, in this case controlling who becomes an American and how they become an American, and giving powers to government to deal with dissent that challenges or threatens the structure of government. We then move on. We look at interactions with Native Americans. We look at the dangers posed by slavery and how that shaped American government, and in particular American policing. We look at the Civil War and the expansion that crisis brought in the nature of government. And we take it all the way to the present. About a third of the class really takes place in the 21st century, with an emphasis on, lately, immigration and how the challenges of a multi-ethnic, multiracial society have shaped government's response to events. And this is the important part, how the structure of government shapes the events that we deal with, what we conceive of as a danger, as a threat to American security. The Civil Liberties class focuses roughly on the same topics, but where the first class focuses on the impact of these challenges on American government, on voting, on the powers of the presidency and of Congress and of the judiciary, the civil liberties class asks a more fundamental question. And it's a combination of political science, of history, and of ethics, which is, what are the proper responses to these challenges? Instead of how did we respond, what were the range of responses and how effective were they? And what should we have done in these situations? Both constitutionally, but also ethically. And so when we look at, for example, the Alien and Sedition Acts, we talk about the power of government over people's lives and how much power should government have over people's lives. When we talk about the Red Scare in World War I, we talk about the rise of an executive power to stifle dissent in time of conflict, and whether that was proper or not. Ultimately, the goal of the civil liberties class is to prepare you to think in terms of what is the best response to the challenges we face in a dangerous world, both domestically and internationally. And I also teach a class occasionally, a reading class on immigration. But those two classes, domestic security and then civil liberties, are the ones I primarily teach in the master's program. And they'll form sort of the root of my talk today. One of my broad topics that I work in generally has to do with what I call practical democracy, the nuts and bolts of making government by the people, for the people, of the people work. And a lot of that has to do with, of course, with running elections. And a lot of my research has been on elections, contested elections, election law, and politics. But also it's led me into areas such as immigration and questions of belonging, of citizenship, of in-groups and out-groups, which again brings us back to the topic of national security. So today's topic is a focus on how elections can have an impact on civil liberties, which again, as I conceive of it, is the question of what is the proper response to the challenges we face. There's a range of responses that are available to us when we are facing challenges. They can be as extreme as going to war, or extreme in the other direction as literally becoming isolationist, ignoring the problem, not touching it. Both are legitimate responses, but they come with consequences. War, obviously, people die, we get caught in conflict, it costs money, and it raises tensions within the domestic sphere that often result in government having to deal with dissent. Isolationism basically withdraws from the world and allows for the growth of larger problems further down the line. And which approach we take often depends on who's in charge, not surprisingly. I've been teaching a class on the presidency in my undergraduate classes, and I talk about the rules of the presidency. And one of the rules of the president is that president's power have grown over time. That, I call this the first rule of the presidency, that powers once gained by the executive are not given up, even if you ran against the abuse of that power in seeking the presidency. And so what we've seen throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century is an ever expanding power and role for the executive in American government. And it's most notable when we are looking at questions of national security, because in foreign policy and national security, the executive already has a leadership role built into the Constitution. And so when we're looking at this, who becomes president really does shape how we respond to the world, how we respond to challenges, how we respond to dissent. And yes, I'll ultimately get to the 2020 election. But I want to start with the 2000 election. The 2000 election was a contest between a Republican Party and a Democratic Party that at this point were at odds with each other, but in which the candidates really weren't that fundamentally different. One was a compassionate conservative, the other was a caring liberal. And their foreign policy attitudes were not that different from each other. But there was one key element, and that was a willingness on the part of George W. Bush to be proactive. What caused it, of course, was not the election, but who was president when we had 9/11. And 9/11 challenged our national security stance. It was a shock to the system. And the question is, how do you respond to the challenges posed by an attack such as this? Well, one answer is you go after those who attacked us. And we did. The Al-Qaeda was training in Afghanistan. We went to Afghanistan to break up Al-Qaeda and the Taliban that had supported them. We also made another choice. We chose not to go after Saudi Arabia, where the majority of the terrorists who took part in 9/11 came from. Why? Well, Saudi Arabia was an ally, and we had a president in George W. Bush with close personal ties to the Saudi government. His father had been very close to the Saudi government. He himself had been involved in the oil and gas industry, which created links with the Saudi government. And so Bush chose to soft pedal our response to Saudi Arabia, even though Saudi Arabia provided the majority of the terrorists and much of the funding for Al-Qaeda, but rather to go directly at Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Now that, again, it's a legitimate choice to make, but it has consequences. Namely, we only went after half of the problem that caused 9/11. It's kind of like going after, well, it's kind of like saying, I'm going to lose weight, and I'm going to do it only by exercising, but I'm going to eat everything I want. I'll eat all the fatty foods, all the chocolate, all the cakes. It's a system. And if you burn 7, 8, 10,000 calories a day, it works. But short of going out and becoming a lumberjack and cutting down trees or digging ditches, you're not going to do that. The ideal approach is limit your calorie intake, increase your calorie burning. And surprise, surprise, you will lose weight. But we didn't choose that. Again, had Al Gore been president, we probably wouldn't have gone to war with Saudi Arabia. We were already allies with them, but there would have been a lot more pressure on Saudi Arabia to tamp down on its conservative imams who were pushing the religious agenda of a very conservative Islam that was then being taken by Al-Qaeda and warped into a call for jihad. And of course, then there's the other effect of having a Bush in power at this time. Namely, that the Bush team, not just George W., but his vice president and other individuals, felt they had unfinished business in the region. Most of the people who worked for Bush had ties with his father in the late 80s and in the 90s, in particular with the Gulf War. Now, in the Gulf War, we chose to stop and not topple Saddam Hussein. Now, Saddam Hussein deserved toppling. He was a dictator. He was destructive of his people. But he also had often been an ally of ours against a country that we saw as a greater threat, Iran. So we stopped. Well, many on the Bush team, including W himself, felt that there was unfinished business. And so they pushed to expand our war in the Middle East to include Iraq. And in the process, they came up with what's called the Bush Doctrine. The idea that we will go to conflict not just when attacked, such as in Afghanistan, but also preemptively for those who we view as an imminent threat to the nation. And then they proceeded to demand the creation of an imminent threat in Iraq. That led us to the whole weapons of mass destruction thing. They really believed in it. There's a wonderful story of Dick Cheney going to the CIA and going to the intelligence community and saying, once we were in there, where are the weapons of mass destruction? We know they have weapons of mass destruction. Why can't you find it? Well, the answer was because it wasn't there. We had taken scattered evidence and created a belief that wasn't actually supported by the evidence when you looked at it with a clear eye. But they didn't have a clear eye. I very strongly doubt that Al Gore would have gotten us into Iraq. I'm sure he would have attacked and done as we did in Afghanistan, but I doubt he would have gotten us into Iraq. He didn't have unfinished business in Iraq, which George W. and his team did. And yes, we can blame us here in Florida for the fact that George W. was president. We had really bad voting machines, and we paid the price of a super close Florida election. Florida elections are usually very close. But the outcome of that election chose a president whose response to 9/11, though similar in direction to that of his opponent, went much further. Consequences. In the process, we saw attacks on fundamental civil liberties. Although W did his best to try and make a distinction between terrorists and Muslims, the two very quickly became synonymous with each other among supporters, Americans in general, especially supporters of the president and his party. We saw a willingness to go the extra mile and ignore fundamental civil liberties and constitutional dictates, to engage in torture, to engage in holding people without access to a court, without charging them, the creation of black sites around the world, the creation of Guantanamo Bay, to keep them out of the clutches of the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Again, it's unlikely that a Gore administration would have gone that far. Might have, but unlikely. We also had the rise of spying on the home front, the creation of a technology to watch the world, but in the process also watching Americans, which, by the way, is against the law for the National Security Administration and the CIA to do. But they were involved. They were reading all of our internet, all of our emails. They were reading who was sent to, but they still had a sense of who you were talking to, who you were communicating with. That was the price we paid for these wars, leaving out the price that our soldiers paid and leaving out the $1 trillion cost. And ultimately what became the longest wars in American history. Consequences of elections. Now, I'm not saying that we wouldn't still be stuck in Afghanistan right now had Al Gore been president. We would have gone in, and we probably still would be stuck there. There's the old joke about never fight a two-front war in Central Asia. Don't take on France and England on one side and Russia on the other, which Germany learned to its problems in a couple of wars. The other is, don't ever, if you're an imperial power, send troops into Afghanistan. It's a morass and it's hard to get out. The British learned that, the Russians learned that, and we've learned that. But again, consequences, choices. Now, by the end of 8 years, we were tired of this war. We were tired of this conflict. We were tired of this president, and the economy was paying the consequences for the economic policies of that president, which doesn't have to do with national security, but a cratering economy not only resulted in the election of a new president, but it also shaped the policy choices that new president can make. Barack Obama was elected on a campaign of hope and promise, and we're all Americans, and getting us out of the wars of 9/11. He also came in, and literally on the day he became president, he was being told by his Secretary of the Treasury and the Chair of the Federal Reserve, we got about 3 days before we don't have an economy left. So the focus had to be on saving the economy. That took time and energy away from dealing with the foreign policy concerns we had. And it resulted in a necessity of finding a way to continue to protect the nation, ideally in a way that was cheaper both in money and in lives. So Obama worked to get us out of Iraq, the war of choice. He also wanted to get us out of Afghanistan, but again, proved much harder to do. So the Bush Doctrine said, we will attack you if you are a threat to us, as we conceive it. The Obama Doctrine is, we will seek to limit your ability to harm us without going into full-out war. So one of the things that the Obama Doctrine did was it tried to shift the conflict from armies to drones, from full-out conflict to almost a Cold War sort of conflict, engaging in diplomacy, engaging in support of allies in the region, and ultimately trying to prop up governments that were seeking to limit the rise of radical Islam, which brought us once again back into Iraq, in this case now, to fight ISIS. Again, events happen, presidents respond. It is likely that had John McCain won the election in 2008, given his history, that while he would have moved back away from the black sites and the torture and what have you, he would have been much more aggressive in terms of responding to these challenges than Obama was. Obama's a very cautious individual. John McCain was more belligerent, more sure of himself in some ways, and more willing to act and use hard power, where Obama sought to use soft power, or I'm not sure what we'd call drones, intermediate power, distance power, as a way to respond to these challenges. And so we entered into a period where we sought to support the Arab Spring, where we through our support in Egypt to bring down the regime, even though that didn't turn out very well in terms of the response once the, and I'm blanking on the name of the dictator in Egypt at the time, that regime collapsed, ultimately leading into the Islamic Brotherhood winning democratic control of Egypt, followed by a military coup and a new dictatorship in control of Egypt. So sometimes it doesn't matter who's elected. We're gonna run into problems, but choices are made. And Obama wanted to reach out more to the voices of discontent in the Middle East, to build up the secular forces of change, the democratic forces of change in the Middle East. He also wanted to shift our focus from the Middle East to Asia, although he found that quite difficult to do. So again, what we see here, oh, by the way, and this is that first rule of the presidency, he didn't stop any of those civil liberty issues that happened under Bush, even though he attacked Bush for his attack on civil rights, for attack on civil liberties, for his attack on freedom of expression. Most of those programs continued, they just simply went deeper down. They were hidden more. Ultimately, it took Edward Snowden to bring out just how much we were spying on the world, and in the process, again, on Americans here at home. Elections have consequences. Now, Hillary Clinton was a part of Obama's foreign policy team. She supported the Iran nuclear deal, which was an effort to try and deal with the big problem, which was to say, keeping Iran from having nuclear weapons, at the expense of ignoring the smaller problem that Iran was funding radical groups throughout the region. One problem at a time was basically his approach. Had Hillary won, we would have seen a continuation, I suspect, of those policies. In many ways, at least in terms of national security, she would have been a third term of the Obama administration. Domestically, I'm not so sure, but internationally, definitely. Because she had helped shape the Obama international policy and doctrines. But Hillary didn't win. To everyone's shock and disbelief, that guy from reality TV won the election. And he had a real different way of looking at the world. An idea that had roots in the 1930s. The idea of America first. Well, in the 1930s, the America First movement was a movement that believed in isolationism. We don't want to get involved in European problems. And had links by many in support of the rise of Nazism in Europe. So America First carries connotations of both isolationism, but also an acceptance of autocracy and even, and once again, I'm blanking on the word here, where one person has all power in government, the lack of democracy. You all know the word, even if I can't remember it. The point here is that that did shape what we call the Trump Doctrine. One of the ways people have described it is that America first means America alone. Pulling out of international treaties, pulling out of international relationships, not working with our allies. In fact, reaching out more to our opponents, the threats, than to our allies. Reaching out to strongmen, authoritarians, rather than democracies. In the process, raising the specter of a more authoritarian government here in America. Long story short, an entire 2 generations of foreign policy consensus was wrecked as a result of the outcome of the election in 2016. Not destroyed, but shattered. The assumption the United States would be a leader of the West, of the free world, that we would work in alliance with NATO, with the European Union. The idea of the shift of focus from the Middle East to Asia to take on the growing might of China. And that we would do it in alliance with all the other Asian players who are really scared about China. Well, we didn't do that. We had choices to make, and the choices were to go in a very different direction. We took on China. We've raised the specter of conflict with China, which is, I think, going to happen anyhow, and will continue under the new president. But we did it largely bilaterally, on our own, ultimately leaving our allies in Asia to enter into agreements with China on their own, ones that do not serve the best interests of the United States and our national security. Elections have consequences, and who's in charge shapes how we approach national security concerns. It's a simple reason, it's a simple lesson. I mean, it's kind of common sense, but the process of implementing it can be quite complex. And one of the things that we look at when I teach the civil liberties class, and when I will ultimately be teaching classes focusing on the Trump administration and foreign policy, is the nature of those machinations, of those choices. Which leads us to the current election 2020. We were faced with a stark policy differential choice. Trump promised 4 more years of America first. Further withdraw from international agreements, further withdraw from our international alliances, more outreach to authoritarian governments. Biden came back and said, that's just plain wrong. What we need to do is get back to the consensus we had on national security from the Cold War on, which is that America is strongest when it works in alliance with others, that America is best when it leads rather than abandons our allies. And that's what I'm pretty sure we will see the effort of the Biden administration to do. Question is, are they going to be able to pull it off? I'm not sure we can put the water back in the broken bottle of the Iran nuclear deal. Our relationship with China is more contentious than it was 4 years ago. China is now an emerged superpower and very interested in being treated as a superpower and acting as a superpower, which, well, when superpowers clash, the world shakes and thus poses challenges around the world and ultimately national security challenges. Meanwhile, the domestic policies of Trump exacerbated pre-existing social turmoils in America, a growing split between the parties, class divisions, race divisions, questions about immigration and our place in the world, all of which we are going to have to come to conclusions about, to decide how much of that we want to keep and how much that we want to change, and how much we can change under a Biden administration. You know, I used to pity Obama. He walks in as president. Huzzah, we won! I mean, swept in, big victory. And then being told, oh, by the way, you got to save the economy like that. Talk about a letdown. Talk about a challenge. Biden's got it worse. The economy is more shredded. We're dealing with a pandemic that we have to fix before we can fix the economy. Racial, ethnic, and class differences are at a high and causing enormous stress on America. And faith in government has been shook to a level we haven't seen since the Gilded Era of the late 19th century, which is appropriate because Trump was very much a Gilded Era president. Long story short, we made a choice. We will have a different foreign policy. But Trump's choices push us in a direction so at odds with the general approach of America to national security that getting things back to the normal trend, where a choice of preemptive strike versus reactive strike is the big difference, as during the Bush Doctrine. Well, we are in interesting times, which, if you haven't learned yet, is a curse, because interesting times are hard. In any case, it really does make for interesting studies. And that's what our program focuses on. How do we shape these choices? What are our options? What works, what doesn't work, and more important, what is the right thing to do as opposed to the wrong thing to do? Using the past as a model, looking at it from an ethical stance, from a political science stance, from a technical computer literate stance. We're not going to train you, if you come into this master's program, to be a cop, for example. What we do provide you are the tools to be a better cop or a better member of the intelligence community or other such organizations, because we've trained you to think about these issues. And most of our students have ended up getting jobs with government in one form or another. They've gotten to live their dream of working in national security or working in policing, or a number of people who've ended up working in dealing with immigration issues. We currently have somebody who's working down at Southern Command. The classes that we offer, like I said, don't necessarily give you the technical skills that those jobs need, but they can train you on the technical side. What they provide you, though, is the ability to think, respond, communicate, all of which makes you a better employee and ultimately, hopefully, makes you more happy in the job that you get. So even if you don't go into policing or national security issues, it's a worthwhile program, if only to have a better idea of how the world works. But most of our students do see this as a career step, and we do take that into account when we teach. In any cases, let me stop babbling on now and see if there are any questions. I see there's a few in the chat, but I don't know quite what they're saying. Let me see if I can open that up.
Yeah, there is one in the chat and there's one in our Q&A section. So the first one was, how best can the people compensate for an excess of power in government due to new emerging domestic crises, especially if national policy violates constitutional guarantees?
Well, one answer is elections. When people vote and participate, they can choose who they, I'm going to say trust, but ultimately who they think is the better of bad options in some cases to lead us in the direction they want to see us go. There are clear choices between Trump and Biden in terms of domestic policies, in terms of how they will respond to the challenges of American society today. Biden is much more likely to play by the existing constitutional rules in a way that Trump simply ignored. The outcome of the election was the result of a lot of people raising their voices and saying, we don't want that anymore. Of course, we also saw that a lot of people said, we do want more of that. We're a very divided nation right now. One of the hard parts of being president is trying to pull that nation back together. We chose the candidate who will at least make the effort. The existing president, he had no interest in pulling us together as a nation. He had an interest in dividing us. So There's that. The other is work for reform through non-government agencies, through government itself, through politics, and raise your voice in what's the opposition? That's not the right word. Raise your voice in support of the world you want to see. You can't always get it, but you have a better chance of getting it if you speak up than if you say nothing. Next question.
I think our next question was from the same person, and they asked, do you believe that the war could have possibly ended sooner if not for the media's broadcast that called for revisions to the ROE, thus minimizing military power?
Okay, I see. I know where you're coming from. The way I look at it is when Bush made the choice to expand the war into Iraq, he undermined what seemed to be a winning military strategy in Afghanistan. He left the job 3/4 undone or half undone. And as a result, he gave the opposition the chance to regroup. Maybe if we had kept our focus on Afghanistan, we could have broken the back of the Taliban. Maybe not, but we'd have a better chance at it. As for the question of the media's role in that, there is a question about what people understand about it. And the media generally have their own take on these things. A challenge about government power, a distrust of those in power. But this is something that government took advantage of. And so I don't have a firm answer to that, but it's a topic worth studying and exploring.
Dr. Zelden, I have a question for you as well. Are we going to see, especially with your experience with immigration and some of the class you teach, are we going to see like a similar to the Gang of Eight, bipartisan group here coming to solve the immigration issues that we're facing, or is that, never going to happen again?
Given the state of the parties and the fact that the parties have grown further apart, more oppositional, and more absolutist in their views because of the split within the electorate in the same direction, I'm not sure a Gang of Eight is possible. We have a Gang of Eight sort of event going on right now of moderates and open-minded conservatives and some open-minded liberals among both parties on the issue of providing stimulus, less than anyone wants, but more than other people want. Split it right down, maybe right down the middle. $1 billion instead of $2 billion dollars in stimulus. But I also don't see that actually going anywhere in the current Congress, which leads me to think that especially if the Democrats don't take the 2 seats in Georgia, it's going to be a long period in which not much is done through legislation, and we'll pay the consequences of that. I think you will see a continuation, even if the Democrats gain a 50-50 split in Congress, of government by executive order. The trend that Obama was forced to start, that Trump gleefully added to, I think Biden will reluctantly have to continue. The problem with immigration isn't the idea that it's a broken system and that there are practical ways to fix it. The problem is conceptual. Do you consider providing a path to recognition and legality to those who are in this country for a long period of time, paying taxes, who have not broken the law, to be smart and settling almost a bleeding wound? or do you consider it amnesty to lawbreakers? Unfortunately, two parties are at very different takes on that. And Trump only made that division wider. And unless we can find a way to bridge that, it's going to be very hard to come up with an answer on that. Ultimately, what we're going to need is non-divided government. And the outcome of the election was a clear victory for the Democratic presidential candidate, but a much more ambiguous take on Congress. We seem to like divided government, even though divided government in times of crisis is the worst thing you can have. Better to have one party in charge making choices that later on you have to correct than to do nothing. Unfortunately, I think we're in a do nothing stage. But again, we don't know what the outcome of the election is going to be in Georgia. And should the Democrats win both seats, it would give the Biden administration the opportunity to get some change through. But unfortunately, they would pretty much have to do in the filibuster in the Senate, for which there are good reasons to do so beyond the immediate problems. The filibuster has clearly outlived its usefulness. The Congress it was created for doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't for decades.
I also had a student that had emailed me who was taking a final tonight, but she wanted to ask you, is Biden going to be a one-term president, or either from his own personal standpoint, or just from the nation standpoint at that point when he either comes back for re-election?
Partly it depends on his health. If he's got the energy to go for a second term, he will. Whether he can win it or not depends on how well he handles COVID, the economy, and the stresses of society in terms of policing, in terms of immigration, and what have you. If he can get 2 out of 3 worked out to most people's satisfaction, he won't have trouble winning re-election. But that's a big if. He's betting he can. Historically, Democrats generally do clean up the messes left by Republican administrations. And if you look at the deficit, if you look at a number of issues, the changes wrought by the Republicans come at a cost of disorder at the end. Democrats come in and clean that up. But that means they're always sort of starting from behind the starting line, and therefore can't go as far as they want. But if we can get a good solution to coronavirus, if we can then distribute that solution in an equitable and quick manner, if we can then restart the economy, and if we can do that in the next 2 years, first of all, I think the Democrats may not see the losses in the midterm election that usually happens during the president's first term. And I think it stands Biden in a good stance for re-election. The other topic, the immigration, the police reform, the tensions of class and status in America. If he can just find some solutions that meet the needs of those who already voted for him, that would serve him well. But he's not going to find a solution that solves all of our problems because we're just simply too divided in that area, which is a shame. But also the consequence of having a president who came in as a disruptor, which is what we wanted, by the way. People voted for the outsider because they wanted him to shake things up. Well, he sure as hell did that. Revolution is messy. And that's really the reality we face. I think Biden would like to be a transformative president. I think he'd be happy to settle for a president who gets us back on course and provides solutions, if not answers, to the dilemmas we face. and in that case, maintain the political coalition that got him into power in the first place. So I think if he's up to it, he'll run. I think if he runs, he'll win or lose based on what he does in the next couple of years.
We have one more question that just came in.
Good.
Do you foresee any hopes of reform similar to a wholesale constitutional convention in Biden's future?
No. Constitutional conventions are good in that everything's on the table. They are bad in that everything's on the table. And what happens if the guys you disagree with are the ones who elect more people to the convention? In other words, they're dangerous. They're like doing surgery on a living patient without anesthesia. It can work. It can save the life of the person. It's also likely to do a lot of damage and be really messy. There's enough people who are happy with the current situation or afraid of the choices we make in a con that I don't see it happening. Things either going to have to get a lot worse or we're going to have to come up with a lot more consensus about what we want for there to be a constitutional convention. And again, the convention that wrote our Constitution was able to do things that wouldn't happen today. They operated in secrecy. They operated out of the eye of the American people. They were able to make deals to argue points that weren't necessarily what the constituents who elected them would have wanted, but were necessary to come up with a cohesive whole. And they understood that their job was not to create the best constitution, but the best that could be ratified. I'm not sure that people we elect to a constitutional convention will be able to do that. And if they did, I'm not sure that we'd be satisfied with the best that could be ratified approach. And ratification would tear this nation apart, as it did, by the way, in 1787 and 1788. Ratification almost tore the nation into shreds because it's a tough decision whether to ratify a new structure of government. And let's not forget that the very first day our new government went into being, into operation, we passed 12 amendments to the Constitution to fix what the original Constitution had not done. 11 of which ultimately became part of the Constitution. 10 of them as the Bill of Rights, and then the last is our last amendment dealing with raises for Congress. So, yeah, it could fix a lot of problems, or it could literally tear the nation into shreds. I'm just not sure we would agree on the ground rules for a constitutional convention that would result in a document we could ratify collectively. If I thought we could, I would be in favor of one. But ultimately, we do have the restart button. We can turn off the nation and boot it up again with a constitutional convention. The founders thought that we'd have to do this every 25 years. And in a sense, we did, not every 25 years, but following the Civil War with the addition of 3 amendments that transformed the entire nature of the Constitution. We just haven't done that since to an extent that it's needed. So, again, great topics for discussion. Definitely part of the mix in the classes that I teach and my colleagues teach in this program.
Well, Dr. Zelden, I really appreciate it. And, some of the audience is just recently dropped off, but we've obviously gone right to the hour here. So I appreciate that. And thank you for the lecture. I think it was very informative. I know we've gotten some very positive feedback so far. So
good. My pleasure.
Awesome.
Hope to see some of the people here in my classes sometime.
Awesome. Well, thank you again.
Okay.
The audience, we appreciate it. If you have any questions or thoughts on there as well, we'll be receiving the survey in the next couple of days. And we'll talk to everybody very soon. Oh, I think there's another one in the Q&A, Nicole. Oh, thanks, Dr. Zelden.
Thank you.
So-
Yep.
My pleasure, Alyssa. Hope I was able to answer your question, well, as best I could.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Have a great.
You all
Thank-
have a good night, and let's do this again sometime in the future.
Awesome.
We
Dr.
can
Zelden, we'll be
modify
in
the
touch.
topic a bit.
We'll definitely be in touch here the next couple days too as well, and I'll get you the recording as well.
Okay, thank you. You all take care.
Have a good night.
You as
Good
well.
night.
Good night.